It was just after 3 in the morning when she parked her car, 100 feet from her own front door. She almost made it. For the next half hour, she would scream for help on a quiet street in New York City, surrounded by the windows of dozens of sleeping neighbors. And the story the world would later be told about that night would become one of the most famous and most misunderstood crimes in American history. This is the murder of Kitty Genovese, and this is what really happened in her last hour. Her name was Catherine Susan Genovese, but everyone called her Kitty. She was 28 years old. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair and a quick, easy smile. People who knew her remembered the smile first. She had grown up in Brooklyn, the oldest of 5 children in a close Italian-American family. When her mother witnessed a violent crime in the city in the late 1950s, the family moved out to Connecticut, shaken. But Kitty stayed behind. She loved New York. She wasn't ready to leave it. By 1964, Kitty was managing a bar called Ev's 11th Hour in Hollis, Queens. She was good at it. She handled the money, the late nights, the difficult customers. Her bosses trusted her completely. She worked long hours, often until the bar closed in the early morning, and then she drove home through the empty streets to the quiet neighborhood where she lived. That neighborhood was Kew Gardens, Queens. It was the kind of place people moved to for safety. Tree-lined, middle class, respectable. Kitty lived in an apartment above a row of small shops on Austin Street, near the Long Island Railroad station. She shared that apartment with her partner, a woman named Mary Ann Zelenko. In 1964, their relationship was something they kept private. It was a different time, and the world was not kind to people like them. But at home, on Austin Street, Kitty had built a life that was hers. On the night of March 12, 1964, Kitty worked her usual shift. The bar closed. She counted the money, locked up, and got into her red Fiat to drive home. It was a short drive, only a few miles. The streets were nearly empty. It was a cold early spring night, and most of Kew Gardens was already asleep. What Kitty did not know was that somewhere on the road behind her, a car had begun to follow her. The man driving that car was named Winston Moseley. He was 29 years old. To everyone who knew him, he seemed almost invisible in the most ordinary way. He had a steady job operating business machines. He was married, with children, and he owned a home. His neighbors thought of him as a quiet, polite man. There was nothing about him that made people afraid. But Winston Moseley had a secret life that no one around him could have imagined. Later, he would tell police that on that night, he had left his sleeping wife at home, gotten into his car, and gone out for one reason. He was hunting. He was looking for a stranger to kill. And on the road that night, his headlights found Kitty Genovese's small red car. It was around 2:30 in the morning when Kitty reached Kew Gardens. She pulled into the parking lot of the railroad station just across from her apartment. It was a route she had taken hundreds of times. Her front door was only about 100 feet away. She turned off the engine. And behind her, Moseley parked his own car and stepped out into the dark. Kitty got out. She started walking toward her building, toward the safety of her own door, and then she noticed the man. Something about him, about the way he moved toward her in the empty lot, told her that something was wrong. She began to walk faster. Then she ran. She didn't make it. Moseley caught up with her under a street light near the corner, and he stabbed her twice in the back. Kitty screamed. And here is the part of the story that would echo for decades. She screamed into the cold night air of a sleeping neighborhood, and her voice carried up to the windows of the apartment buildings around her. She cried out the words that so many people would later claim they heard. "Oh my God, he stabbed me. Please help me. Please help me." Lights came on in the windows above. People stirred in their beds. And in one of those apartments, a man named Robert Moser opened his window, looked down into the dark, and shouted at the figure on the street below. Let that girl alone. It worked. For a moment, it worked. Winston Moseley was startled. A voice from above, a witness, someone awake. He turned and walked away, leaving Kitty wounded on the sidewalk. The lights in the windows were a warning, and he retreated from them. Kitty was badly hurt, but she was alive. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet. She made her way around the side of her building, toward a back entrance, trying to reach her apartment. She was bleeding, moving in the dark, out of sight of the street now, and she very nearly reached a door. But Moseley did not leave. He went back to his car. He has said that he changed his hat to alter how he looked, and then he returned, on foot, to finish what he had started. He searched the area where Kitty had disappeared. He followed the trail, and he found her, collapsed in a hallway at the back of the building, near the foot of a staircase, where almost no one on the street could see. There, hidden from the windows that had once frightened him away, he attacked her again. This second attack was the fatal one. It was brutal, and it was final. And then, in the quiet that followed, a door opened. A neighbor named Sophia Farrar, a friend of Kitty's, had been woken and told that something was happening. Without knowing what she would find, without knowing if the attacker was still there, Sophia ran down to that hallway. She found Kitty, terribly wounded, and she did not turn away. She gathered Kitty into her arms and held her. Kitty Genovese was still alive when the ambulance came. She died on the way to the hospital, but she did not die alone in that hallway. She died being held by someone who loved her. The attack, from the first scream to the last, had lasted around half an hour. That should have been the whole story. A terrible crime, a brave neighbor, a city in mourning. But 2 weeks later, the murder of Kitty Genovese became something else entirely. It became a legend, and the legend would say something dark about all of us. On March 27, 1964, the New York Times published a front-page article. The headline was "Unforgettable. 38 who saw murder didn't call the police." The story claimed that 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Kew Gardens had watched Kitty Genovese be stabbed to death over the course of more than half an hour. It claimed they had stood at their windows, watching, and that not one of them had lifted a finger to help. Not one had even picked up the telephone until it was far too late. The article was written by a reporter named Martin Gansberg, and it had been pushed by one of the paper's powerful editors, A.M. Rosenthal, and it landed like a bomb. The idea was horrifying. 38 people, 38 pairs of eyes, a woman screaming for her life, again and again, and an entire neighborhood that simply chose not to care. The story spread across the country and then around the world. It was in newspapers, on television, in sermons from church pulpits. Kitty Genovese stopped being a person and became a symbol of everything supposedly wrong with the modern city. People asked how human beings could become so cold, how a crowd could watch a murder and do nothing. Psychologists were fascinated and disturbed. Two researchers, John Darley and Bib Latane, designed a series of experiments inspired by the case, and they discovered something strange and real about human behavior. They called it the bystander effect. The finding was this: the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any single one of them is to help. Not because they are cruel, but because the responsibility feels spread out, divided among the crowd. Everyone assumes someone else will act, and so, sometimes, no one does. The phenomenon was so tied to this case that it earned a second name. They called it Genovese syndrome. For decades, that was the lesson. Kitty Genovese, the woman murdered in front of 38 indifferent witnesses. Her name appeared in psychology textbooks read by millions of students. It became shorthand for human apathy. There was only one problem. The story The famous one, the one in the textbooks, was not true. In the years that followed, journalists, scholars, and eventually members of Kitty's own family began to take the original article apart, line by line. And what they found was that the number at the heart of the legend, 38 witnesses who watched and did nothing, did not hold up. Most of the people in those apartments had not seen the attack at all. It was the middle of a cold night. Windows were closed. Many who heard something heard only a short cry or muffled shouting and assumed it was a drunken argument or a lover's quarrel spilling out of the nearby bar. The attack was not one continuous event in plain view. It happened in two separate places, and the second, fatal attack happened in a back hallway, hidden from almost every window on the street. And, crucially, some people did try. Robert Moser shouted from his window, and that shout drove the attacker away the first time and may have given Kitty a chance she would not otherwise have had. Evidence later emerged that at least one or two people did try to telephone the police, and in 1964, there was no 911 system. There was no simple, universal emergency number. Calling the police meant finding the right local number and trying to explain yourself to whoever answered. Some accounts say a witness called and was not taken seriously. And then there was Sophia Farrar, who ran into the dark toward a possible killer to hold a dying friend. In the famous version of the story, she does not exist at all. In 2007, a careful study in a leading psychology journal concluded that there was no evidence for the central claims of the original article that 38 witnesses watched, and that none of them did anything. In 2016, the New York Times itself published a piece acknowledging that its 1964 reporting had been deeply flawed, that the number had been exaggerated, and the indifference overstated. The reporter and editor had taken a real and terrible crime and shaped it into a story that was simpler, darker, and more powerful than the truth. So why does this matter? Why correct a 50-year-old headline? It matters because Kitty Genovese was a real person, not a symbol. For decades, her memory carried an accusation she never deserved. The idea that her own neighbors had coldly watched her die. Her younger brother, Bill Genovese, spent years of his life investigating the case, knocking on doors in Kew Gardens, trying to learn what the people there had actually seen and done that night. What he found was not a neighborhood of monsters. It was a neighborhood of ordinary, frightened, confused people, woken in the dark by sounds they did not understand, in an age before emergency calls were easy. Some failed to act, some tried. One held his sister as she died. The bystander effect that Darley and Latané discovered is real. It has been confirmed in study after study, and it is worth knowing about, because understanding it can make us more likely to step forward instead of waiting for someone else. If you ever learn one thing from this story, let it be this. In an emergency, do not assume someone else will call for help. Be the one who calls. Be the one who acts. That lesson is real, and it is valuable. But the woman whose name became attached to that lesson was more than a cautionary tale. She was 28. She managed a bar. She had a quick smile and a private life she had fought to build in a city she loved. She had a family who adored her and a partner who waited for her to come home that night and never saw her again. As for Winston Moseley, the man who killed her, he was arrested less than a week later, almost by accident, picked up during a household burglary. He confessed not only to Kitty's murder, but to others as well. He was convicted and sentenced to death, though that sentence was later reduced to life in prison. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and he died there in 2016 at the age of 81, more than 50 years after the night he followed a small red car into Kew Gardens. Kitty Genovese was buried in her family's plot in Connecticut. She was here for 28 years, and in the end, the truth of her last hour is quieter and sadder and more human than the legend that replaced it. She was not watched by 38 people who did not care. She was a young woman who was failed by some, helped by others, and held, at the very end, by a friend who refused to look away. That is who she really was. And that is what really happened in the last hour of Kitty Genovese. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, take a moment to remember the real person at the center of it, not the headline. Subscribe to The Last Hour, and we will see you in the next case.